Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this month's iteration of SureCloud Cyber Threat Briefing. As usual, my name is Craig Moores. I look after the risk advisory practice here at SureCloud, and I'm joined by Hugh, Raynor, one of our senior security consultants and cloud security leads. It's actually been quite a quiet month. We haven't seen any significant cyber breaches, which I don't think we've said in the last couple of years. However, we have still pulled out a few topics to talk through this afternoon. And we're going to start, Hugh, with the recent 0 days. I think everybody loves a 0 day because they're largely unknown until they happen. And we've had a couple of them. So we had Follina, and we had Atlassian released or spoke about a 0 day within Confluence. So do you want to maybe start by sort of talking a little bit about Follina, and then maybe move on and we'll talk a bit about Confluence?
Yeah, sure. So Follina is the name given to this vulnerability. It was first seen to be exploited in April. So there was quite a bit of time that it was being used without anyone detecting or understanding it. Basically, what it does is attackers can create a file, normally a Word file. Some email attachments work as well. And that file then calls out to the Microsoft Support Diagnostic Tool, MSDT, and by providing that file with a crafted input, padding it out to beyond 4,096 bytes, that deletes, well, not deletes, but disables its request for a passphrase that it normally would ask you, and then gives you full remote code execution on the machine. That's in the context of the of like Microsoft Word or whatever that's running it. So yeah, and we've just seen in the chat that's just been fixed on Patch Tuesday a couple of days ago. So yeah, incredibly important there to get that patch rolled out. Yeah, it's been actively exploited for a few months, and it's really quite an interesting one. Quite a lot of detail in it. We won't go into it in this threat briefing. A security guy called John Hammond has done a really good YouTube video on it, explaining in detail, how it works and giving a rundown of, a demo and a walkthrough of it. So I think we can put that in the chat. I'd strongly recommend, if you've got an interest in the Follina vulnerability, to check that out.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Is there anything specifically, other than the fact that this has been exploitable for a little while now, is there anything explicitly different about this 0 day? Yeah,
so up until recently, the modus operandi would have been to use macros, macro-enabled documents. But obviously recently Microsoft decided to deprecate that sort of functionality. So no surprise that attackers are going to be looking for alternative ways to achieve code execution on machines through Office documents and emails and things like that. So yeah, it just goes to show really that it is a game of whack-a-mole in security, and that as soon as we think we've come up with a reasonably good way of eliminating one avenue of attack, a new one that achieves the same goal is just going to spring up.
Yeah, Matthew beat me to my final point, which was more the fact that it's just been patched, hasn't it? So again, thinking about vulnerability management and ongoing kind of cyber hygiene, it's obviously really important that people are rolling those types of patches out into their environments and understanding really where they're exposed.
Certainly, yeah. Similarly, I suppose with the Confluence, so it's Confluence data center and Confluence server. There we've got an unauthenticated code injection of vulnerability. So that's quite significant in that it's code injection, allowing arbitrary execution of code, but also it's an unauthenticated vulnerability as well. So you don't need to have a valid account. Again, that one has been patched, but it is a critical issue. So if you haven't, if you're running Confluence self-hosted, crucially, if you're running your Confluence through Atlassian, so you've got your organization.atlassian.net and you access your Confluence through that, not a problem. You don't need to worry about anything. It's only if you're self-hosting Atlassian and you need to get that patch deployed as quickly as you can. They have also, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think it's really important that people that are using the hosted versions, obviously, there is a note from Atlassian around the kind of lack of exposure on that front. This is really directed at people that host it themselves, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. And I think Atlassian have been quite good, because as well as putting out the patches, in a reasonable time frame, they've also, they acknowledge the fact that in a lot of organizations, it's not as easy as just, right, okay, quick, let's deploy a patch as soon as we can. So they've also provided workarounds as well, where you can put a specific jar file on the server and sort of micro patch it like that, outside of the normal update cycle.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of organizations now, the way that they respond to these things, I think is really important. I was reading up on some the security posture of a potentially new piece of software that we're going to be using. And I noted on their website that they'd actually been through a number of the recent CVEs, and they'd been looking at whether they affect their systems. And they publish all of that alongside their security certifications and things for their product, which I thought was quite interesting. Not a lot of organizations are actually willing to put that information out into the public domain unless, obviously they have a breach. So I think it's obviously interesting to see that they're taking this step change into being very proactive around making things easy to obviously remediate and working with organizations to obviously try and prevent those things from being exposed for any longer than they need to. Quite an interesting sort of change in direction for some organizations to be considering.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, I think we'd all sooner trust a vendor that is open and transparent with, hey, look, this thing isn't right, here's the fix, as opposed to the approach of, let's just silently patch this in the background in the normal update cycle and hope that people don't realize until then. Even if that results in fewer headlines, I still think I'd sooner go with the people that were regularly disclosing issues, but also on top of remediating them.
Yeah, and I think we know from general security risk management that nothing is ever perfect, and I think dealing how you deal with those obviously gives you a lot of reputation and credibility advantage if you are, as you said, quite open and transparent about the way that you're dealing with security, either within your product or within what you're delivering out to your customers. So yeah, I agree. I think it's a very positive thing that organizations are working hard to obviously minimize the potential impact of these things once they've been found. So quite a proactive response there. And we've drifted slightly, Hugh, into one of the points we were going to talk about as well around vulnerability management. I think we both noted over the last month there were quite a lot of different pieces of information out there about the way that obviously organizations are dealing with vulnerability management. And, whilst there haven't been any significant breaches or exposures as a result of those, I think cyber hygiene has been, something that a lot of people have been talking about more recently as well. So how exposed on average do you find organizations are when you conduct testing? How many of those are isolated incidents that have been turned into something a bit more so by some of the news feeds, and actually how exposed do they leave organizations?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I'd say it depends heavily on the scope of the test and whether the organization or a system has been tested before. But if the scope we're given is wider, similar to that a real threat actor would be looking at, i.e. a whole organization, yeah, there are more often than not things that get missed. And I think it's, like with vulnerability management, it is the fact that a lot of the time our way in will be through sort of undocumented systems, things that were spun up for testing purposes or a specific event, and then either not decommissioned or decommissioned incorrectly, that then aren't on an asset register, they're not looked at, and they fall by the wayside. And obviously, as with everything in security, 3 months later, there is a way in because a new vulnerability has been published. So making sure that you've got good vulnerability management practices, regular, even just vulnerability scanning with limited human input across the whole of your estate, all of your IP ranges, whether you believe there to be like systems on those addresses or not, is a really good way of getting rid of that low-hanging fruit. Because if you don't know if you don't know it's there, you can't do anything about it, and a threat actor will find it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think just looking at those two examples that we talked about earlier, I think most people would be relatively on top of Microsoft patching, particularly if their technical stack is kind of predominantly Microsoft. But some things that sit kind of on the fringe of some of their sort of more general checks and balances, such as things like Confluence servers, potentially, could be missed in regular patching or update cycles, where, we're kind of dealing with the majority rather than the minority. But I think looking at most of the articles, I mean, it's not that organizations are bad at patching. I think ultimately the landscape has changed quite significantly in recent years as a result of kind of the hybrid working models that we all sort of seem to have fallen into. And again, the estate doesn't get any smaller. So there are often areas where we can miss these things. And, from my perspective, I think reading some of the articles, particularly around where vulnerabilities have been identified in some of these perimeter systems, it's actually, the potential to leave organizations quite exposed. I think, you made a good point around sort of temporary systems and services that are spun up for particular activities and then maybe not managed properly. So I guess, the focus being on vulnerability management, I mean, that's never going to go away, is it? But how could organizations think about the risks presented to them by vulnerabilities differently, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is getting everyone on board, right? Because nobody wants to introduce a vulnerability to an organization. Well, I say nobody. Insider threat is a very real thing. Your average employee doesn't want to introduce that risk to the organization. But a lot of the time, the issues we see arise as a result of someone trying to make their job easier. Is probably the most common one. So where we see organizations with a random Jira or Confluence setup that they weren't aware of that's vulnerable, why is that the case? So maybe it's because the DevOps team feel it's the only tool that they can possibly use to get that done, so they've spun that up themselves. Well, we're understanding the needs of people in the organization, and encapsulating that into your policy and your processes to say, okay, instead of having your team of 6 responsible for maintaining this piece of software running on the corporate infrastructure, we acknowledge that you need it. Let's onboard it into our systems and processes and have it managed centrally. And then that does significantly reduce the risk. So getting everyone on board and having everyone agree on the way forward with things can really work wonders.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, considering that vulnerability management takes up so much time as well. I think looking at kind of this risk-based approach and dealing with kind of the outward, inward, etc. I think it's important to make sure we do stay on top of those. And sometimes, as you said, it's as simple as making sure that we're scanning the right assets on a regular basis and actually identifying some of these problems to be able to deal with it. So interesting points, but I mean, vulnerability management is obviously a critical part of business as usual activities for most technical teams. So I think we can leave that there. One of the other points that I noted in recent weeks, and on sort of different types of attack vectors really, was smishing. And obviously we don't really think about smishing all that much, but I mean, it looks like smishing is on the rise, Hugh. It's probably worth talking a little bit about some of the ways that smishing can be used to gain access to sort of corporate organization environments, and what kind of risks are they presented with? Have you got some examples?
Yeah, so smishing obviously being SMS phishing. yeah, I mean, I'm sure probably most people in this call have had a text at one point saying, you know, your Royal Mail item or your Hermes item couldn't be delivered today. Pay a £1 redelivery charge, and we'll bring it next time. Obviously, you then provide them with your you know, personal data, your name, your address, and obviously your payment details. And it's not £1 they take, is it? It's going to be everything, or they'll just sell the details on a forum. Obviously, that's an individual risk, but certainly we can see that risk extend to organizations as well. So similar contexts, things like late payments, unpaid invoices, things like that, where you know you send that to someone in finance. You know, don't want to cause issues for the organization, and so yeah, they will, you know, click that link and go through and make that payment. I think because we spend so long in our phishing training talking about emails to people, that when it's on a different screen, it doesn't quite twig that it might be the same threat. I've seen that a lot in terms of people just not really realizing that, you know, I guess one of the key things is a lot of organizations, when you get a text message from them, they do just come from a mobile number. So that becomes really hard to distinguish. I think for the longest time, when Amazon sent out one-time pads, you know, they came from a different number each time. You know, recently, a lot more organizations have adopted the technology that just shows the organization name. But equally, you know, that's not like an SSL certificate. There's you know, it's just a name. You can't query that to see the authenticity. It's just a word that's given to you. So that also can be, you know, forged. So yeah, definitely a lot in that space. And also just, I think SMS is, you know, problematic in general. I have conversations with clients where they're discussing using SMS for multi-factor authentication purposes. Yes, an SMS-based authentication system is better than just requiring a password, but it is absolutely nowhere near as good as you know, an authenticator application or a hardware token, because of things like SIM swapping. And again, I've had conversations with clients recently about SIM swapping. People aren't necessarily aware of it. It's a lot more prevalent in the US, but the UK is catching up, and it is becoming more possible here, where a threat actor will work out an individual's phone number, know that they're going to be enrolled via SMS onto some multi-factor services, go into a phone shop and say, "Hi, it's me. I've got a new SIM card. Please transfer my phone number to this new SIM card," and basically steal your phone number, and therefore also steal all of the multi-factor codes and prompts that come through as well. So yeah, SMS basically is riddled with issues when you're trying to use it as a security measure.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And you've got the kind of blend of personal and professional application there as well. So I guess the $1 million question here is what can organizations do to protect themselves? I mean, you're quite right in a lot of the kind of training and awareness that I see and that, you know, the teams deliver. They're very focused on email because it's kind of the primary business communication method. But what about other methods? What about things coming in potentially from public email addresses through Teams? You know, how can organizations protect themselves from these other types of sort of social engineering?
Yeah. So I mean, there's quite a lot of things you can do. Setting up mobile devices, like using the business version of Android, where it's all set up and maintained, you know, by the IT team, and then just handed out to users. And that's configured in such a way that, you know, all corporate data is then sandbox segregated. There's no interaction between applications inside that sandbox and externally. Which, you know, with a traditional deployment is a significant risk if people are using their devices as, you know, corporately owned, personally enabled devices. Yeah, there's absolutely nothing stopping an individual downloading an application onto the device and then letting that get outdated. You know, and then that could, you know, leak and move laterally from that application onto the corporate resources. So having these having these sandboxes that are set up specifically for business use is a really good thing to do. Again, using things like Intune and Apple's corporate device management, they all do the same thing in that they sandbox off those corporate applications so that they're invisible to the rest of the device.
Thanks, Hugh. I guess it's a good opportunity if anybody's got any questions for myself or Hugh, feel free to drop them into the chat window. I think, from my perspective, again, looking more generally at the threat landscape, whilst we haven't seen any notable breaches for the last month or so, I think generally the threat landscape is still quite high. I think there are still attractive targets, and I think there are still opportunities, particularly for things like off the back of the pandemic, and still being used as opportunities for attackers to gain a foothold in organizations. So remaining vigilant, and sort of staff awareness is hugely important as well. Some of the topics that I think organizations focus a bit more so on now, particularly with people working remotely, do focus on things like social engineering and phishing and smishing and some of the other sort of attack vectors that need us to trust our people as much as trusting our technology. So there is obviously some interesting information out there, and I've seen Matthew's just posted a link to a piece of guidance from the NCSE, which again is a really good source for information, isn't it, Hugh?
Yeah, absolutely. The NCSE are really good at keeping up to date. They're not afraid to go against their previous guidance and change things as the landscape evolves, which I think is really nice. A lot of standards and authorities say this is the way it's done, and then in the face of a changing world say no, we said this is how it's done. This is how it's done. Key example of that is the around password policies. Previously, they were advising you wanted as complex passwords as you can have with upper, lowercase, symbols, alphanumeric, all of that. And now they're just saying, what, that wasn't the best approach. What we want is just length.
Yeah, and I think, again, in time with quantum computing, that's probably going to change, isn't it? So guidance will move maybe more towards kind of certificate-based authentication, or something else that again gives a different layer of security. So interesting things, but I think again some of the key themes here, be aware of your vulnerabilities and your exposure through some of the systems that you may not focus on all the time. Think about your scanning and make sure you're dealing with vulnerabilities as they arise, so that you're obviously reducing the risk of an exposure. And again, think about other techniques that are outside of the norm, particularly things like smishing. But from our perspective, that's all we've got for today. Thank you all for attending and for your time. Hugh, thank you for your insight and expertise as always. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Hugh or myself and to have a look at some of our other podcasts. But hopefully we'll see you back in the future. Otherwise, have a great afternoon. Thank you, everybody, and take care.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.